Hello, this is the first part of chapter 4, and the first part of chapter 4 deals with a lot of these kings that we see in the late 1600s and early 1700s. And we've touched on a number of these people in chapter 3, but let's go ahead and review some of those kings, and then that will be a good kicking off point for what we're talking about in chapter 4. In chapter 3, we talked about James I, who was king right after Elizabeth, and then his son, Charles I, who was an absolute monarch. Both James I and Charles I, absolute monarchs. Charles I was beheaded, and in comes Parliament, and the ruler of Parliament at the time was a guy named Oliver Cromwell. This was called the English Civil War, where Charles I is beheaded and Oliver Cromwell comes in. Cromwell was a Puritan, and after about a dozen years of Cromwell, the English are pretty certain that they want a king back again, but they know that they don't want another absolute monarch. And so they restore, it's called the Restoration, they restore a king to the throne, called and his name is Charles II. Charles II is the son of Charles I, the guy who was just beheaded. Charles II wants to do everything just to keep his head, and so he is not going to pass a whole lot of laws. He is not even going to pretend to be much of an absolute monarch. He is basically a party boy, and he is giving away lots of land to his friends, especially over in the New World in America. Once Charles II dies, his brother takes over, James II, and he is much more of a absolute monarch. And when push comes to shove, toward the end of James II, we have what's called the Glorious Revolution. James II is going to be overthrown. Well, he's going to be given a choice. Either you can leave England, which he eventually does, he goes to Scotland, or you can suffer the fate of your father, Charles I, and be beheaded. Okay, so now that we have all those down, let's get into chapter 4. Charles II, he is not real excited about representative government in the American colonies. Even though Charles II wants to keep his head and he doesn't want to be overthrown, he still feels like he's king, and so he still wants to flex those muscles every once in a while. And so Charles II revokes the Massachusetts Charter. In other words, Massachusetts, if you remember, Massachusetts has the power to elect its own people. They have their own government, and pretty much all parts of the Massachusetts government is elected and represented by the people. And if you remember, most of well, not most of, but the government is run by Puritans. You have to be a saint in order to be a member of government. You have to be a saint in order to even vote. And Charles II is going to revoke that Massachusetts charter. That's in 1684. The reason why he does this is that he wants to reduce the amount of Puritan influence. By this time, by 1684, Charles II is pretty sure that Puritans are not very influential in America anymore. We'll get to that here in just a second. And so he sees an opportunity here to get rid of Puritan influence and get rid of their power. Plus, Massachusetts was involved in lots and lots and lots of smuggling. There were these navigation acts we touched on in chapter 3. We're going to get much more into here in chapter 4. And basically, just very briefly here, the navigation act said that the only country you could trade with is with England. Well, people in Massachusetts wanted to trade with other countries because they would get better prices from other countries for their goods. And so there was lots and lots of smuggling going on. The king also wanted to get rid of those representative assemblies. He wanted to be in charge of, especially Massachusetts, but all the colonies. So he wants to get rid of any sort of assemblies where the people are in control, where the people have any power. And so the king, before he makes this move, he wants to go see how powerful the Puritans still are in Massachusetts. And so he sends some fact finders over to Massachusetts to look at the landscape and see how powerful these Puritans still are in Massachusetts. The fact finders come back to England, and they tell the king, hey, listen, king, the Puritans, nobody likes them. They have no power. They have no influence in Massachusetts. So whatever you want to do to the Puritans is going to be fine with the general population of especially Massachusetts, but also of New England. Well, the problem with that is that they were not really telling the king the truth. These fact finders go back to England and tell the king what they want to hear because they want to keep their heads as well. And so if they told the king, hey, listen, Puritans, they have very strong roots in Massachusetts, they have a lot of power in Massachusetts, that is not good news for the king, and invariably the king would have taken it out on his fact finders. So once Charles dies, his brother takes over. This is 1686. James II takes over, and he decides to permanently get rid of Puritan influence in government in especially Massachusetts. And so he creates this super colony where we have these individual colonies. We talked about the original 13 colonies. He puts together a number of these colonies into one single colony. This super colony is going to be called the Dominion of New England. And this Dominion of New England includes Connecticut, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, all under one government run by a king's governor. And so they're all going to be one colony. Now, the one big thing here that kind of should stand out is Massachusetts and Rhode Island. If you remember, Rhode Island and Massachusetts don't get along very well. In fact, Massachusetts is calling Rhode Island Rogues Island, and where the King's Refuse goes or all the debris from Massachusetts goes to its final resting place. And so Rhode Island and Massachusetts are not real excited about being in the same colony with each other, but here they are. The government is set up, this Dominion of New England, the government is set up by the king. There's a royal governor, a governor appointed by the king, and then that governor is appointed by the king's council, again appointed by the king. There's no representative assembly, and so it's this governor and this king's assembly that is running the show, that's making up all the laws and doing whatever they want to do. The first and only governor of the Dominion of New England is a guy named Sir Edmund Andros. He is obnoxious. You think of that person with no social skills, and this is Andros. He's loud. He's boisterous. Nobody likes him. He's dictatorial, and he pushes pretty much everybody around. And he can, because he is the only person he has to answer to is the king, and this is exactly what King James II wants. Now, about the same time, we're going to add 2 more colonies to the Dominion of New England. We're going to add, in 1688, we're going to add New York and New Jersey to the Dominion of New England. And if you remember how those are set up, there's a lot of Quaker influence in both New York and New Jersey. And of course, the Quakers don't get along the Quakers get along with everybody, but nobody gets along with the Quakers. And so here we have Puritans and Quakers in the same colony, and this is just not going to work. Governor Andros, levied taxes without any approval from any sort of representative government assembly. When colonists tried to protest, Governor Andros said, "You have no right to protest." He started looking into the finances of Harvard. If you remember, Harvard originally set up to train ministers, but it is a private institution, and they are not used to the government getting their fingers or looking into the finances and where all the money is going in Harvard. Andros said, if you owned any land before the creation of the Dominion of New England, you no longer own that land. You can reapply to gain access to that land again, but all that land is going back to England. And so you can reapply for that land, and if you're allowed to go back to that land, then you have to pay taxes on that land that previously you've been living on. So it'd be a little like the government telling you that you no longer have your house, and you can reapply to go back to live in your house. But once you do that, you're going to have to pay more taxes in order to be in that house. If you do get your land back, as a landowner, you have to pay everlasting quitrents to the government. If you remember what a quitrent is, it's basically a tax on land ownership. And so you have to pay these quitrents every year to the government. Again, not what the colonists are used to. The Dominion of New England are going to enforce the Navigation Acts. We touched on that in Chapter 3. We're going to have stronger Navigation Acts here in Chapter 4. And remember, this is an attempt to stop smuggling. And so Governor Andros is going to try to put a stop to all the smuggling going on. And remember, for a lot of people, especially in New England and particularly in Boston and Massachusetts, smuggling was a way of life. In fact, for most people, it's almost heroic that these people are selling things to other countries and buying things from other countries without having to go through England and pay all the taxes to England. Another thing that Andros did is that he forced a Boston Puritan congregation to share their meeting house with an Anglican minister. And remember, the Anglicans, the Church of England, are not excited about Puritans, and Puritans are not excited about the Anglicans. And so there's a lot of arguing going on back and forth. And now these Puritans have to share their meeting place, share their church, essentially with the Anglican minister. And he also put a dramatic reduction in the ability to meet as colonial assemblies. Andros is not excited about people gathering together to say, hey, we need to make changes, especially to the power structure. We need to be able to elect our own people. And so Andros is not going to allow much of that. There is going to be some of that, but Andros is going to put a stop to much of that assembly. He also puts heavy restrictions on colonial courts, on the press, on schools. He cuts back on what people can say, especially about him or the government. He tells schools what they should be teaching. And so it's a very heavy-handed administration by Governor Andros. All of this is alienated the colonists. And as the colonists start to get more and more upset, Andros sees this, and in order to put down or to make sure that the colonists don't get too out of hand, he calls in for more soldiers. And so there are more soldiers in the streets of Boston, and this is going to be a recurring theme now for the next 100 years. He's going to call in more soldiers to make sure everybody is peaceful in Boston. Well, these soldiers in Boston and in Massachusetts more generally, remember, these are Puritan communities, and soldiers don't generally act in a Puritan way. And so these Puritans in Massachusetts are complaining that the soldiers are being loud, are being noisy, are being boisterous, they are drinking, they are partying, they are having fun, and especially they're doing all of that on the Sabbath day, which all of that is no good. And then you put it on the Sabbath day, and it just makes things even worse. Well, in 1688, so this is a very short-lived dominion of New England. In 1688, King James II is overthrown by the people, by Parliament, and this is called the Glorious Revolution. Now, King James II, as we mentioned a little while ago, is given a choice. Either you can leave peacefully, or we can cut off your head. And King James II decided that he wanted to keep his head, and so he wound up being exiled to Scotland, where he spends the rest of his life. The only reason why King James II had been allowed to rule anyway is that his children, and specifically his daughter Mary, was Protestant. King James II was the last Catholic king of England, and so he was able to rule because the next person in line is going to be Mary, who is a Protestant. Well, once King James II is kicked out, Queen Mary comes in, and her husband William of Orange, and so it's William and Mary now King and Queen of England. And William and Mary, being Protestant, they are going to dismantle the Dominion of New England and give back the charters to all the colonies in America with some changes. One of the major changes is that, especially in Massachusetts, that all free men are allowed to vote and participate in government. Of course, this is going to not go well with the old-time Puritans, who said the only people who could be involved in government are the visible saints in the church. As William and Mary took apart we just mentioned, took apart the Dominion of New England, returned all the governments to the colonies. And once the word of the Glorious Revolution is out, James II is out, the only person who was protecting Governor Andros is now gone. And so now the colonists are going after Andros. And Andros sees this happening, and Andros tries to run away. Well, Andros is pretty quickly caught. He tries to wear a disguise. He tries to put on, well, he does put on a dress, and he tries to dress up as a woman. And as he's trying to leave, he is captured. And the reason why he's spotted is that somebody saw his basically combat boots that no woman would be wearing. And so they caught Andros. Now, they didn't try Andros. They didn't execute him right there on the spot, but they did send him back to England. And so Andros is no more in the colonies. All right, there are some lessons that the English should have learned from this whole situation with Governor Andros and the Dominion of New England and the response to that Dominion of New England. First of all, the colonists were their own people. They saw themselves, they are starting to see themselves as Americans first and not colonists of England. And so they are starting to see themselves as their own people, as wanting to run their own government, as wanting to represent themselves, as wanting to make their own decisions. And so those ideas are starting to take seed in the colonies, and that is just going to grow as we go along. Second thing that England should have learned, and probably didn't, is that the Puritan roots are very, very strong, especially in Massachusetts, where for about 100 years we've had Puritanism. No, not that long, I'm sorry. For about 60, 70 years we've had Puritanism, and that is not going away anytime soon. Even as we get into the first presidents of the United States, our second president, John Adams, had Puritan roots. And so that Puritanism is very, very strong in Massachusetts. And the final thing that the English should have learned from all this is that the colonists are willing to take up guns when they feel like they are threatened or when they feel like they are not being treated fairly. In this case, they are willing to take up guns against the governor of the Dominion of New England, Edmund Andros, and they are willing to capture him and, in this case, send him back to England. Well, this is not going to be the last time that the colonists take up guns when they feel like they are being treated unfairly. All right, so as we get further and further into the 1600s and early 1700s, England still sees the colonies as basically an ATM machine. We are going to try to take all the money that we can out of the colonies and bring it to England. Remember what the purpose of these colonies are for. The purpose of the colonies are there to enrich England. England is not there to enrich or help the colonies. The colonists exist, and the colonies exist for the benefit of the king and for England. Now, there's a couple problems with that. The first problem is that England is 3,500 miles away. They may as well have been 1,000,000 miles away. It may as well have been putting a colony on the moon and trying to run that colony. It's just not going to work. It takes 3 months for a message to get from England to the colonies, and then for a response to go from the colonies back to England. And so any type of control from England is going to be very, very difficult to enforce. Politics. In the late 1600s, mid-1600s, late 1600s, England is fighting with each other. We have the king's fight with Parliament. We have Parliament fighting with the king. Nobody is really paying attention to the colonists all that much, or to the colonies all that much. There is the English Revolution, the English Civil War. We have Oliver Cromwell. So the politics of England is constantly in turmoil. And during this time, the colonies are starting to grow by themselves and starting to run themselves. It's a little like if for 17 years your parents are never around, and all of a sudden you turn 17, 18 years old, and your parents decide to come back and say, hey, you know what? I decide I'm going to be your parent now, and I'm going to lay down some rules, and you have to be home at a certain time, and you have to eat your vegetables, and you have to do your homework, and you can't be out late at night, you can't have friends over, and all of a sudden trying to lay down all these rules after being gone for a long, long time. That is just not going to work, and that's what's going to happen here with England. And Another issue that England has is trying to run the colonies is that most people in England just really don't care. Most people in England don't see the benefit of having English colonies in the Americas or in North America. Um, they know that family members or friends have moved over here, but they really don't see any sort of benefit of having these colonies. And on their daily lives, they just really don't care. Okay, well, so here we are, mid 1600s, 1650, and England decides that they are going to try to get more money out of the colonies. And this is done by a policy called mercantilism. And mercantilism is, we mentioned it before, is this idea that the colonies exist for the benefit of England and not the other way around. It's the beginning of a capitalist economy, that we are going to do whatever we can to make some money and to be able to buy and sell goods at a good price. We want to buy goods as low as we can buy, for the lowest price that we can buy them for, and we want to sell our goods for as much as we can sell them for. The principles of mercantilism. One of the main principles of mercantilism, this idea of this initial idea of capitalism, is that the world's wealth was limited, that there's only so much gold out there, that there's only so many raw materials out there, there's only so much out there that you can control, and you need to control as much as you can. And the more you control, the less your enemy or your rival is controlling. And so by controlling everything you can, that is limiting the amount of power of your rival. Secondly, it is a nation's goal to export more than it imports. And so for England, it is their goal to export more things than they import. And so what's going to happen here is that England is going to import raw materials from the colonies. They are going to finish those raw materials. They are going to make them into finished goods, and then they are going to sell them back to the colonies. Of course, when they buy raw materials, that is at a less price than when they turn around and sell the finished products back to the colonies. So that's how they are going to have a positive trading balance. We've said this now twice, but another principle of mercantilism is that the colonists exist for the benefit of the motherland and not the other way around. England is not there for the benefit of the colonists. The colonists are there for the benefit of and for the enrichment of England. The first attempt at mercantilism. First of all, in about 1650, we had the first navigation acts. In 1650, England passes a law that says there are certain items that can only be traded with England. And so you can only trade things such as sugar or tobacco or cotton or indigo with England. You cannot trade that with any other country. Now, if you're following the law and you're in the colonies, understand what that means, is that there is no competition for your goods. England is the only country buying your goods, and England can tell you what price they're going to pay because it's illegal to sell that to anybody else, and so you must sell it to England. And so the prices are kept artificially low on those raw materials. This is one of the reasons why colonists get into smuggling, is because they can sell those items to other countries at higher prices, especially things like sugar and especially tobacco, things that countries cannot get from any place else. England also tried to expand the Caribbean Empire. They have their islands that they are controlling, and so England is trying to expand their production, especially of sugar, in the Caribbean islands. And so, but the problem is they need more people down in the Caribbean in order to grow, especially sugar. And so they tried to get Puritans, they tried to get people from New England to move down to the Caribbean, and specifically Puritans to move down to the Caribbean. Their thought was, the English thought was, okay, we can solve a couple problems here. First of all, we can increase our labor force in the Caribbean if we have more people there. And you know, who would not want to live in the Caribbean if you're living in New England? The Caribbean has, you know, nice gentle winds, it's nice and warm during the winter. Compare that to New England, where it's a very, very difficult life. It's very cold, it's very rugged, there's lots of storms all the time. And so it's a very rough life in New England. Who would not want to live in the Caribbean? The second goal for England is to diffuse the power of the Puritans still. And by moving some Puritans down to the Caribbean, then there are fewer Puritans in Massachusetts. Well, here's the problem. No Puritans want to move down to the Caribbean. Can you imagine if you are a Puritan and you are it's not the Caribbean, I understand, but you're told, okay, you're now going to live in Rio. Well, that's not going to work. There's too much sin going on in the Caribbean for any good Puritan to move down to the Caribbean. So this first attempt at mercantilism is during Oliver Cromwell. And for the most part, Cromwell is not successful in his attempts at mercantilism, at his attempts at the Navigation Acts. All right, so now we spin forward to 1660 and Charles II. Charles II, the first king after Oliver Cromwell is gone. Remember, he is the son of Charles I, who was beheaded, and Charles II just kind of wants to keep his head, but at the same time, he wants to at least pretend like he's king and make some decisions. So one of the things that he does is he is trying to make as many friends as possible, and the way you make friends is by giving them presents. Well, what does a king give people? The king gives lots and lots and lots of land to people, and we talked about this in chapter 3. These are called the Restoration colonies. King Charles II is giving away things like, Pennsylvania and New York and New Jersey and the Carolinas to these proprietary governors. And the proprietary governors are supposed to run the government and then report back to the king. The problem is they don't report back to the king. They like running their own government, and so that whole relationship falls apart. King Charles II does take control of all of the eastern seaboard of North America, and he is trying to control more of these colonies, trying to put more of these colonies under his control, especially these restoration colonies. And so there's this argument going on back and forth between the proprietors and the king. And he passes effective navigation acts. In 1660, pretty important year, 1660, effective navigation acts come in. Under these new navigation acts, he forbids any trade by any one of the colonies to anywhere except for England. And so anything that's being traded must be traded on English ships and crewed by English crews. They cannot go anywhere else. You don't want Americans crewing these ships because all of a sudden it will these shipments might go down to the Caribbean. They might be trading with the Spanish. They might be trading with the French. They might be trading with the Dutch. And so we want English crews from England transporting these goods back and forth to America. There's also a list of enumerated goods. Enumerated goods are specific things that can only be traded with England. And this list grows as we go along. We had a first list under the first navigation acts, but now we are having a much, much stronger list. The first enumerated goods are these: sugar, cotton, not so much cotton yet, but we're starting to grow some cotton. Indigo, remember indigo is that purple dye, and the big one is tobacco. Tobacco, tobacco, tobacco. And so these are things that can only be shipped to England, which means the prices on those things, especially tobacco, are held artificially low. And it's, the 1660s, the major factor was that last one, tobacco. All right. Other things that are eventually added to the navigation, to the enumerated goods list under the Navigation Acts. In 1699, the Woolen Act. All wool needs to be sent to England. England will make things out of that wool. They'll make blankets and sweaters and clothes and whatever else, and then sell it back to the colonies. You cannot make your own clothes out of wool. You shear the sheep, you send the wool, and then the finished product come back to America. In 1704, rice is added to the enumerated good list. That becomes a big crop in the Carolinas, but especially in South Carolina. In 1705, a lot of things that deal with the Navy, so what's called naval stores, pitch, which is kind of this black tar, turpentine, mast, lumber, all of the stuff is added to the enumerated goods list. And all of that stuff needs to be shipped to England. They're going to make ships out of it. They're going to send those ships back to the American colonies to be sold there. 1721, copper is added and furs are added, especially beaver skins, but furs in general are added to the enumerated goods list. And then it just starts to get a little silly. In 1732, it's called the Hat Act. H-A-T, the Hat Act. This says that it is illegal to make your own hats. Any hats that are made must be made in England and then shipped back to the American colonies. Now, most of those hats are made out of beaver skin. And so the American colonists are going to trap these beavers or, and get these beaver pelts. They cannot do anything with them. They must ship them back to England. England will make finished goods out of them, mainly hats, and then sell them back to the American colonists. 1733, the Molasses Act. All molasses coming from the English West Indies, must go through England first before going back to the American colonies. 1750, the Iron Act. All iron. You cannot make anything out of iron. All iron must be shipped to England. England's going to make stuff out of iron and then sell that back to the American colonists. So by 1750, we are getting very, very close to a very key year, 1776. And so we're only 16 years away from the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And all of this is leading to the Declaration of Independence. All right. The effects of the Navigation Acts. First of all, some special interests in both England and the American colonies take on, they gain political power and economic power as well. Like American producers of silk and iron and dyes and hemp and lumber are all paid bounties by English factory owners in order to produce more. And so these Americans who are producing this stuff, they are starting to get more and more money for some goods. But at the same time, things like tobacco, those prices are going down and down and down because there's an ample amount of tobacco being grown. Sugar growers of the Caribbean are being favored over New England rum makers. We have people who make stuff out of iron in England gain power over the iron producers in the American colonies. And so we start to see these little groups of people gaining both economic and political power in Parliament and having more and more control over what's going on. But most of these groups that are gaining power have direct ties to Parliament and are actually in England. Another effect of the Navigation Acts, it decreases colonial trade and manufacturing because colonial trade and manufacturing is illegal. You cannot manufacture your own stuff. You cannot trade your own stuff with any other country except for England. There is an increase in English revenues because of taxes placed on these goods being shipped to England. So not only are American colonists having to pay more for goods coming in from England, they're also having to pay taxes on stuff coming out of the American colonies. And so American colonists see more and more taxes all the time, and which leads to a general discontent in the colonies. And by the time we get to the 1760s, and especially after the French and Indian War, 1763, we are going to see lots of American colonists be pretty grumpy about not being able to control their economic lives. All right, so this all leads to a lot of discontent in the colonies. There's a lot of colonial debt that is being accrued in the colonies because of this idea of mercantilism and the Navigation Acts. If you think about all the money is going to England. Very little of that money is coming back to the colonies. The colonists are being paid a little bit for their raw materials, but they're having to pay a lot more for the finished product coming to England. So most of the money is leaving the colonies, going to England, which is just exactly the purpose of mercantilism. Most of the wealth should be going to England under the idea of mercantilism. There is no competition on prices, so raw materials, the price of raw materials are kept very, very low. But then at the same time, when they have to buy stuff, they have to buy stuff at England's prices, whatever England decides. Tobacco prices fall because it's an enumerated good. There's no competition from other countries to buy tobacco. And at the same time, lots and lots and lots and lots of tobacco is being produced, which is also keeping tobacco prices very, very low. There are no banks in the colonies. Colonists are buying more than selling. And so specie, we talked about specie before. Specie is this idea of gold and silver, and so it's also called hard money. All that specie, or most of that specie, is leaving the American colonies and going to England. And so colonists are starting to resort to bartering in order to survive. They don't have money, they don't have anything else, they can't print their own money, they can't do anything. There are no banks to borrow money from, and so they start to barter back and forth. I'm producing this, you want what I produce, I want what you're producing, and so maybe we can make a trade. Response of these colonial governments. The colonial governments are trying to do whatever they can to survive, especially economically survive. Colonial governments start to print their own money. And so now you have Massachusetts printing its own money. You have Virginia printing its own money. You have Connecticut printing its own money. Now there's some problems with that. Well, let's talk about the benefits first. If you are in Connecticut and you want to buy something, you can probably use Connecticut money to buy something in Connecticut. The problem is if you want to buy something from Massachusetts, the people of Massachusetts don't want Connecticut money. And nobody in England wants colonial money at all. And so when colonists are trying to pay for stuff, pay for finished products with colonial money, this colonial money is really worthless in England. And the merchants in England are getting pretty tired of colonists trying to pass off what's now worthless colonial money. There's a lot of, and so in order for you to be able to buy anything, especially in England, you have to pay so much of your colonial money, and that causes inflation of your colonial money. And so it takes more and more and more of your colonial money in order to buy anything from England. And so pretty quickly, Parliament forbid the printing of any colonial money, which of course means that colonists go back to not being able to buy hardly anything. In Virginia, planters are trying to figure out a way to increase the price of tobacco. Now, there's a couple ways to increase the price of tobacco. First of all, to reduce the production of tobacco. Well, England doesn't want that because if you reduce the price of, if you reduce the amount of tobacco, you're going to raise the price of tobacco. And so nobody in England wants to pay more for tobacco. So they want everybody in Virginia especially, but also in Maryland and other colonies that are producing tobacco to produce as much tobacco as possible to keep the prices of tobacco very, very low. And so in Virginia, they try a couple things. First of all, they tell farmers in Virginia, okay, stop producing tobacco, or you can only produce so much tobacco. This sounds like a good idea if everybody cooperates, but the problem is nobody lives close to each other. And so I can't see what my neighbor is doing, and more importantly, my neighbor can't see what I'm doing. And so when everybody says, okay, yeah, we'll produce less tobacco, that should raise the price of tobacco. But when I'm hearing this, what I'm hearing is everybody else is going to reduce the amount of tobacco that they're growing, which means if I grow more tobacco, then I can sell my tobacco at a higher price because everybody else will cause the price of tobacco go up, and I'll have more tobacco to sell, and then I'll be able to earn more money by selling more tobacco. The problem is everybody thinks like me. And so everybody, instead of reducing the amount of tobacco, everybody is actually going to grow more tobacco because they're all thinking everybody else is growing less tobacco, which will raise the price. Of course, everybody grows more tobacco. That causes the tobacco prices to go down even more. All right, so that doesn't work because we can't trust anybody. We can't trust any of these farmers in Virginia to grow less tobacco. So let's try this. If we can't get people to voluntarily grow less tobacco, let's make it harder for them to grow tobacco. And so Virginia agreed to stop the importation of slaves. Slaves, of course, being the main workforce in Virginia, in Maryland, in these other tobacco, in North Carolina, and these other tobacco growing communities or colonies. And so if we stop the importation of slaves, there will be fewer slaves, and then we won't be able to grow as much tobacco, and that will raise the price of tobacco. Well, again, here's the problem with that. This is messing with the economy of England. One of the major companies in England is called the Royal African Company, and it's essentially a slave company. What the Royal African Company does is they will go down to Africa, they will capture slaves, and then they are going to sell those slaves back to the Caribbean islands and then also to North America. Well, if you stop importing slaves, that's going to cause one of the major industries of England to go down. And England, especially Parliament, is not going to allow that to happen. By 1776, all of the above lead the colonies to start saying, give me liberty or give me death, which is a really interesting phrase. Give me liberty or give me death. Now, when most people think, give me liberty or give me death, when most people hear that phrase, they are thinking about freedom. They are thinking about being able to make your own choices. But here's what, for those colonists, that really means. They want the liberty, they want the freedom to control their own economy, to control their own finances. And so when we get to the American Revolution, yes, it's about freedom, it's about freedom of speech, it's about freedom of government, but most importantly, it's about freedom of economy, the freedom to run our own economy without influence of England. All right, so positives and negatives of mercantilism. First of all, positives. Now remember, whenever you talk about positives, it's positive for some people, but not so positive for other people. So, all right, positives for England. First of all, England grows to be the most powerful country on earth. Because of mercantilism, because of this idea of raw materials being shipped directly to England, and then England having this captive audience, if you want to buy finished goods, if you want to buy manufactured goods, you have to buy English goods. It is dramatically increasing the profits for England. And so England is becoming a very, very wealthy country. In fact, England is becoming the most powerful and wealthiest country on earth. Another positive for England is that the colonies grow in size. There's more and more people coming over to the American colonies, mainly because of land. As many problems as the American colonists have economically with England, you're still seen as an English citizen, as all the rights of an English citizen. You are protected by the largest army, the largest navy in the world. So who doesn't want to be a part of that? Plus, if you move to the American colonies, you have the opportunity to buy land. And that is not the case in England. Most of England land, in fact, all of England land is already taken up. And so the only way, if you are English, the only way to own land is to move to America to get some land. Okay, so those are a couple positives for England. Let's take a look for the colonists. The first positive for the colonists is that the colonists are protected by the world's largest army and navy. England has the most powerful navy in the world, has the most powerful army in the world. There's lots of Indians out there that we need protection from, and England is going to protect us from those Native Americans. They're also going to protect us from the French, who are always looking to stir up trouble north, especially in Canada, but moving down into the Great Lakes and as far south as the Ohio River. And so English colonists are protected by the most powerful country in the world. And also for the colonists, until 1773, the Navigation Acts are not really enforced. Now pay attention to that date, 1773. This is just 3 years before the American Revolution. Even though it's a stronger Navigation Acts, even though it's the stronger idea of mercantilism after 1660, for the next 100 years, there's still a lot of smuggling going on. There are generations of smugglers especially in the New England colonies. And so there's a lot of ways to get around the taxes, to get around selling stuff just to England. And so most Americans are born, live, and die with this idea of we're not really tied to these enumerated goods. We're not really tied to the navigation acts. We can sell stuff on our own. We can smuggle stuff. We can sell stuff on the black market. So until 1773, we'll get to 1773, all of that is going to change. Things are really going to clamp down on the colonists. All right, some negatives. First of all, negatives for England. Smuggling is going to be a big thing. Now, again, this is a positive for American colonists. This is a big negative for England. It is almost impossible to stop all the smuggling going on. And again, it becomes almost heroic to be a smuggler. It's a respectable profession. It's almost like being a doctor or a lawyer. Hey, what do you do? Well, I sell stuff. And so it becomes very, very well known, but it also becomes a very respectable profession. Also, another negative for England is English merchants are upset. They oftentimes feel like, and not really justifiably so, but they sometimes feel like Parliament cares more about the English colonists than about the English merchants themselves. And that is not really the case. England is listening to English merchants the most, and again, they are trying to get as many raw materials from the American colonists for as little profit or for as little cost as possible. And so, to say that English merchants are getting the short end of the stick from Parliament is just not reality. Another negative for England is that the Molasses Act, under the Navigation Acts, actually hurt British sugar producers, because as the colonists are refusing to buy molasses or sugar from the British, they are smuggling more and more Dutch sugar and more French sugar from the West Indies. And so these navigation acts are put in there to actually increase profits from certain goods, and in some cases, especially sugar and molasses, it's actually decreasing their profits. All right, a couple negatives for the colonists. The colonists feel like they are in a form of economic servitude or economic slavery, that they are there for the purpose of making England richer. Well, yes, they are. That's the purpose of mercantilism. That's the deal. If you're an American colonist, you're there to make England richer. Another negative for the colonists, there's no encouragement of colonial manufacturing, mainly because it's illegal. And so when we get to 1776, we are going to have a real issue because we can't make anything. We can't manufacture anything. We can't make guns, we can't make blankets, we can't make anything that has anything to do with war. And so when we get to the American Revolution, we're going to have some real issues trying to supply our army. Another negative for the colonists is that we start to see this negative feeling between the North and the South. And the idea that England likes one side more than the other. If you think about the American colonies, North and South, really split at Maryland. So North of Maryland is North and South of Maryland is South. England really does like the South better. If you think about what England is getting, the South is producing tobacco. And later on, the South is, 1820, South is going to produce cotton. And so England does like the South more. And so it's like having two children, and Dad likes, the king likes one child over the other. If you think about the North, Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, Vermont, any of these other places, but especially Massachusetts, England is not real excited about Massachusetts still, because every time there's a problem, it's always Massachusetts. And so, yeah, there's a real gripe between the North and the South that the North feels like the South gets a better deal. I'm sure that whole North-South issue is not going to be a problem later on, so don't worry about it. All right, colonial cities. Changing focus a little bit, let's take a quick look at colonial cities, and then we'll wrap things up. Colonial cities back then were any city larger than 2,500 people. 2,500 people. Let me put that in perspective. Green Valley High School is 3,100 students. And then you add onto that about 100 teachers, a little bit more, other staff, and we probably have right around 3,300 people on campus. And so we would be a large, small city in colonial America. In 1790, pay attention to that date, but 1790, only 10% of Americans lived in a city of 2,500 people or larger. The other 90% of Americans lived in rural or agricultural communities. And so the vast majority of Americans do not live in cities. Merchants are the key people in these American cities. They're the ones buying things, they're the ones selling things, they're the ones selling things to England, selling raw materials to England, they're the ones buying finished goods coming back from England. So merchants are kind of the backbone of these American cities. These people who lived in cities depended upon those merchants, depended on people buying and selling stuff, so they could buy those goods secondhand from these merchants. A middle class starts to develop in cities due to increased business. We start to see professionals, we start to see lawyers, we start to see doctors, we start to see school teachers and professors. So we start to see this group of people that are not super wealthy, but they're not super poor either. And so we start to see this middle class in these cities. We also start to see a lower middle class develop. These are fashion makers, they're wig makers, they're dress makers, they're barbers, they're shoemakers, they're public school teachers. So we start to see this lower middle class develop. And again, these people are not professional types, but they're not desperately poor either. They're not as poor as a lot of farmers, most of the farmers are, but they're not wealthy or wealthier like these professional doctors, lawyers, and other and professors and whoever else. And by 1750, every city of over 2,500 people had a local newspaper, and that was published at least weekly. And so we start to have a more informed public, which is going to be a big deal. There are some problems in the cities. As you get to have a bigger and bigger city, you start to have more crime, you start to have more robberies, more filth in the cities. If you think about the streets of the cities, there's no sewer system, and so all of that stuff gets thrown out the window into the street, and so there's filth everywhere. Horses are going up and down the streets, and horses leave messes as well. And so cities tend to be very dirty places and very, very smelly places as well. Traffic, there's narrow, oftentimes unpaved streets. If you're lucky, maybe you have cobblestone streets that are made out of stones, probably about that big, and those cobblestones are put together, and that will hold down the dust. It makes a lot of noise, but it will hold down the dust in these major cities. And fires are very, very common in these cities as well. Everything's made out of wood, and everything is built very close together. So one place starts on fire, chances are it's going to spread to the next place or the next business or the next home, and then on and on and on again until finally it burns down the entire block, or you're able to put it out. There are some benefits of cities, though. There's more cultural activities, there's more theater, there's more music, there are museums, there are places to go, there are things to do in cities. There's later on, not quite yet, but later on there's going to be amusement parks, not till the early 1800s, but we're going to see that in cities. So there's more stuff to do in the cities, more entertainment, more culture. There's better educational opportunities in the cities. As rural communities grow, they start to have, especially elementary schools or one-room schoolhouses, but those schoolhouses might service several different towns. Well, in a fairly major city or anything over 2,500 people, you start to have not only elementary schools, but you start to have upper education or higher education as well. And even in some of the larger cities, we start to see universities. And also there are more products to buy. If you are in middle farmland in western Massachusetts or western Virginia someplace, you hardly ever see the new thing that comes out. But if you are living in a city, this is where all the finished products first come, and then it's sold to the population. And so you are more likely to be able to buy these new items as they come from England. Okay, that's where we're going to stop.